The village of Glenwood Creek was known for its tranquility, a place where everyone knew everyone, children ran free in the streets, and the doors of the houses were rarely locked. However, this sense of security was shattered the night Emma, a little girl of just 8, mysteriously disappeared. Marley, one of the villagers and father of 2, had always been a vigilant man. He remembered seeing Emma playing with her friends in the Central Park that afternoon. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until evening, when Emma's mother, Lisa, started looking for her daughter, worried that she hadn't come home yet. Everyone assumed that the girl was at a friend's house. Perhaps she had just lost track of time. But as the hours passed and Emma gave no sign of life, the alarm was sounded. The whole village mobilized in a frantic search. Flashlights scoured every corner, from the dark alleys to the forest surrounding Glenwood Creek. The police were called, and all efforts were focused on finding the girl. The last person to see Emma was Diane, a neighbor who lived on the same street. She reported something strange. Just before the sun went down, she saw Emma standing on the corner of her house, staring at something in the darkness. What made her uneasy was the fact that the girl was smiling. But it was no ordinary smile. There was something unsettling, almost forced about the gesture. Diane shouted Emma's name, but the girl didn't answer. She just disappeared into the darkness. The next few days were pure despair for Lisa and her husband, John. The once peaceful village was now covered in a sense of anguish and fear. There were no clues. No trace of Emma was found, not even a footprint. Rumors began to circulate among the neighbors. Some children told their parents that they had also seen Emma that night, and they all mentioned the same thing, the strange smile. But the most disturbing detail came from Jacob, a 10-year-old boy who swore he had seen Emma talking to someone in the shadows moments before she disappeared. When asked who it was, he simply said, "I couldn't see the face, but it was smiling back." The community became apprehensive. Something sinister seemed to be lurking, but no one knew for sure what it was. Marley, watching events unfold, couldn't help but feel a growing sense that something much more terrifying was to come. 3 days had passed since Emma's disappearance, and the small village of Glenwood Creek was in a state of constant vigilance. Residents formed groups to patrol the streets at night. Doors were always locked and children never left the house. Marley, always a calm man, felt the growing tension in his own home. His daughters, Ava and Grace, who used to play freely, now stayed close to him, as if afraid of what was lurking. Then, in the early hours of the 4th day, something unexpected happened. Lisa, Emma's mother, woke up to hear a faint sound coming from the front door. When she went to check, she couldn't believe her eyes. Emma was there, standing in the doorway, wearing the same clothes she wore the day she disappeared. But something was deeply wrong. Lisa ran to her daughter, tears streaming down her face, screaming for John. Emma didn't say a word. She just stood there, motionless, with a smile that didn't seem natural. Her eyes, once full of life, now seemed empty, as if something essential in her had been lost during her time away. John, arriving hastily, hugged his daughter, but soon realized what Lisa had also noticed. Emma was strangely cold, as if she had been out for hours in winter, despite the mild weather. They took her into the house and peppered her with questions. "Where have you been? What happened?" But Emma remained silent, staring into the distance as if caught in a trance. However, what was most disturbing was her smile. No matter what her parents said, the smile never left her face. It was a smile that didn't seem to come from happiness, but from something beyond, as if she was hearing something that no one else could. The news of Emma's return spread quickly through the village. Marley, like everyone else, was surprised and relieved, but soon the relief gave way to unease. He knew something was wrong. Emma was no longer the same girl they knew. She walked around the house at strange times, avoided direct contact with light, and sometimes muttered incomprehensible words while drawing in her notebook. Diane, The neighbor who had last seen Emma before her disappearance decided to visit the family to see the girl. When she arrived, she was greeted with the same disturbing scene. Emma was sitting on her bed, frantically drawing strange figures, a misshapen creature with a distorted smile hidden in the shadows. Diane asked what it was, and, for the first time since her return, Emma whispered something in response. In an almost inaudible voice, she said, "He likes it when we smile." Emma's words spread panic among the few who knew what she had said. Marley, who had started to get more involved in the search for answers, couldn't shake the feeling that this he Emma had mentioned was something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Over the next few days, more children began to draw similar pictures. Some of them were Emma's friends and reported feeling a presence near their windows at night, something that made them smile involuntarily. Emma's behavior, which was already disturbing, began to influence the other children, as if an invisible force was spreading through the village. Marley knew that Emma's return was not a happy ending, but the beginning of something much darker. The calm that accompanied Emma's return was short-lived. After the strange events surrounding the girl, a sense of unease took hold of Glenwood Creek. Marley began to notice a disturbing pattern. First, Emma's sinister drawings, with creatures with distorted smiles lurking in the shadows, and now other children were beginning to exhibit strange behavior too. The night the second disappearance happened, Marley was on his balcony, watching the dark, starless sky. He noticed how the lights in the surrounding houses flickered intermittently, as if the electricity was failing throughout the village. An icy feeling ran down his spine. He knew something was about to happen. The news came first thing in the morning. Tommy, a 9-year-old boy who lived in the next street, hadn't come home the night before. His devastated parents reported that they had last seen him in the yard, playing with his dog. When they went out to call him for dinner, he was gone, and all they found was his favorite toy lying in the grass. Marley remembered how Tommy used to play with his daughters, Ava and Grace, always full of energy and life. Now, the boy had disappeared, and the village went into an even greater state of panic. Just as in Emma's case, the search for Tommy began immediately. The police, already on alert since Emma's disappearance, mobilized all their resources, but there were no clues, no trace, no witnesses who could have seen what happened. It was as if Tommy had simply vanished into thin air. However, there was one disturbing detail that linked the two cases. Samantha, Tommy's younger sister, said that she had seen her brother smiling strangely the night before. A smile she had never seen before while he was looking at something she couldn't see. Faced with this revelation, Marley began to delve deeper into his investigations. He started visiting the families of the missing children, looking for any connection, any clue that could explain what was happening in Glenwood Creek. It was then that he realized that all the missing children, including Emma and Tommy, had reported some kind of contact with something in the shadows before they disappeared. It wasn't just an ordinary disappearance. Something or someone was hunting the children. Conversations among the villagers began to revolve around a mysterious entity, a being that hid in the dark and lured the children with smiles. Some families began to move away from the village, fearing for their children's safety. Others, like Marley's, didn't have that option, trapped by uncertainty and the hope that it would pass. But Marley knew it wasn't that simple. One evening, while reviewing the information he had collected, Marley received a call from Barn Paul, an old friend and neighbor who was also concerned about recent events. Paul told him that his daughter, Lily, had started drawing the same figures as Emma, with the same distorted smile and menacing shadows. Lily said she had seen a shadowy figure outside her window the night before, and she had woken up smiling, not knowing why. Marley's heart raced. It was clear that there was a connection between the disappearances, the smiles, and this entity in the shadows. He knew that Glenwood Creek was on the verge of something much worse. Once again, he looked at his daughters. Ava and Grace had been restless lately, and he feared that they might be next. Marley tried to be firm, but the fear of losing his own children consumed him at every turn. He knew he had to do something, but what? That same night, as the village lights began to flicker again, Marley heard a distant laugh echoing through the streets. A soft, childish sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He ran to the window, looking out at the darkness outside. The village, which had once been his peaceful home, now looked like a hunting ground where something sinister lurked. And then Marley saw it. On the corner of the street, in the dim light of a blinking street lamp, a motionless figure. Small, with a smile stretched from ear to ear. For a moment, he thought it was one of the village children, but when the light flickered again, the figure disappeared. Marley knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Glenwood Creek was in the grip of something far more terrifying than anyone there could have imagined. The days that followed Tommy's disappearance brought more than just fear to the small town of Glenwood Creek. They brought a sense of helplessness. Marley felt increasingly surrounded by an invisible force that seemed to hover over all the residents. Conversations now revolved around one name: the Shadow Entity, a mysterious figure that many believed was responsible for the strange smiles and disappearances. Marley, determined to protect his daughters and find out what was behind this shadowy presence, began to investigate further. He reviewed all the details he had already collected, but something nagged at him, a missing piece that he couldn't identify. He knew that this creature, or whatever it was acting with precision, manipulating the children and making them disappear without a trace. One afternoon, after a tense conversation with Paul, Marley had an idea. Emma, the first child to disappear and return, should be the key to understanding what was going on. Even though the girl had been in a disturbing state since her return, he believed that somehow she knew more than she was letting on. Marley decided to visit Lisa and John's house once again, in the hope that Emma could provide answers. When Marley arrived, Lisa was visibly tired. The pressure of caring for a daughter who was no longer the same was clearly taking its toll on her health. Emma, on the other hand, remained distant, sitting in a corner, rocking back and forth slightly, with that smile that didn't seem to belong to a child. The sparkle in her eyes had faded, but Marley had to try. He approached her slowly, sitting down next to her. Without wanting to frighten her, he spoke softly. "Emma, can you tell me what happened that night? Who did you see?" For a moment there was no answer. Marley almost gave up, but then Emma murmured something, her voice so low that it was barely audible. "He's always here," she said, still with that frozen smile. "In the shadows. He laughs, and he likes it when we laugh back." Marley's heart raced. It was the first time Emma had spoken so clearly since her return. He pressed gently. "Who is he, Emma? What does he want?" The girl looked directly at Marley for the first time since he arrived. Her eyes, which had seemed empty before, now showed a glimmer of dread, as if, for an instant, she had regained consciousness. "He likes the dark. He likes our fear. And he wants everyone to laugh. When we don't laugh, he gets angry." Marley felt a shiver run down his spine. The creature was feeding off the children's fear, but it was using laughter, something normally associated with joy, as a tool to control their minds. He looked at Lisa, who was listening to the conversation with tears in her eyes. Something terrible was rooted in this village, and the more Marley investigated, the more he understood that it wasn't just a legend. Over the next few days, Marley spoke to other parents and villagers. Lily, Paul's daughter, began to report increasingly intense nightmares about a being that watched her at night, always smiling, always in the shadows. Other children were beginning to have the same dreams, all describing the same figure, a tall silhouette with a grotesque smile, who just stood there, watching. It was then, that Marley made an important discovery. During one of his visits to the local library, he found an old diary belonging to one of Glenwood Creek's first residents. The diary contained disturbing accounts of disappearances that took place decades ago, followed by a mysterious apparition that the ancients called the Laughing Man. The creature was described as an entity that inhabited the darkness and appeared every generation, luring children with invisible promises, controlling their minds with smiles, and taking them away, never to be seen again. Marley read the last pages of the diary with growing horror. The author, a man called George Whitley, reported that the creature could only be seen by children, but adults were the ultimate targets of its sinister game. The more the children disappeared, the more fear gripped the parents. And fear, he wrote, was the entity's main food. However, there was a way to ward off the Laughing Man. George believed that light, especially strong light, was the only thing that weakened the creature. In his accounts, he described how an attempt to expel the entity failed due to the residents' fear. The creature fed on both panic and darkness, and when people lost hope, it grew stronger. Marley knew he had little time before more children disappeared. He sensed that the Laughing Man was getting closer, perhaps even to his own home. The flashing lights, the smiles, the whispers in the shadows, everything pointed to an imminent battle. With the new information, Marley knew she had to find a way to confront this entity from the shadows before it consumed Glenwood Creek completely. Marley couldn't shake the weight of what she had discovered in the library. George Whitley's diary resonated in her mind, with every word bringing to light the terrifying reality that now haunted Glenwood Creek. The Laughing Man, the entity from the shadows that manipulated children and fed off their parents' fear, seemed to be much older than anyone there could have imagined. He knew that the children were in danger, but even worse, the whole village was being targeted by the creature. Determined to find out more, Marley decided to visit. Sarah Whitley, George's only living descendant. She was a reclusive lady, known for her wisdom and the strange stories she told about the village. He hoped she could offer some clarity on how to confront the entity. When Marley arrived at Sarah's house, a small old cottage on the outskirts of the village, he was greeted by her deep, attentive gaze. It seemed that she already knew why he was there. "You're here about the children, aren't you?" Sarah said without even waiting for Marley to say a word. Her tone was tired, as if she had told this story many times before, but no one had taken it seriously. "Yes," Marley replied hesitantly. "I found your grandfather's diary, George. It mentions a creature, the Laughing Man. What does that mean? How can we stop it?" Sarah sighed deeply and gestured for Marley to sit down. Her wrinkled fingers pulled out an old wooden box from under a table, and she took out some yellowed papers and old drawings. On the papers, Marley saw images similar to Emma's and the other children's drawings. The same dark creature with its macabre, distorted smile. "I grew up hearing these stories," Sarah began, her voice full of regret. "My grandfather tried to warn everyone, but no one believed him. Back then, children disappeared in the same way they are disappearing now. The creature appears in the shadows, always starting with the most vulnerable. It feeds on fear and laughter." Marley frowned. The concept of a being that fed on both fear and laughter seemed contradictory, but at the same time it made sense. The Laughing Man used children's laughter to involve them in his control, and the parents' fear strengthened his presence. "But is there anything we can do?" Marley asked, his voice low, laden with hope and despair. Sarah looked at him deeply before continuing. "My grandfather believed that the Laughing Man is an entity that lives between worlds. He can only be seen by children and only appears in villages like this, where fear is easily spread. The shadows are his domain, but there is a way to drive him away, at least temporarily." She pointed to a small oil lamp on the table. Light, not just any light, but pure, intense light. He hates it. However, my grandfather discovered something even more important. Sarah paused, as if the next words would be difficult to say. The only way to truly stop the smiler is to face his smile. That means someone has to face the creature without fear and smile back. But there's a risk. The smiler only releases its fangs if it believes it has found a soul strong enough to face it. Otherwise, he takes the one who faces him. Marley felt panic rise in his chest. The idea that someone would have to confront the entity directly was frightening, especially as it would put someone in unimaginable danger. But at the same time, he knew that if they did nothing, the entire village would be consumed. "Has this happened before?" Marley asked cautiously. Sarah shook her head, reluctantly. "Once, in my grandfather's generation, there was a father who tried. He looked directly at the smiler, smiled, and was never seen again. After that, the laughing man disappeared for decades, until now." Marley's fear grew, but at the same time, his need to protect his daughters and the other children in the village grew. He knew that no one else would believe him or be brave enough to try to confront the creature. And although the thought of sacrificing himself terrified him, he knew that something had to be done, and fast. With this new information, Marley returned home. He told Paul about what he had learned, hoping that together they could come up with a plan. Paul, although skeptical at first, knew that something was deeply wrong and reluctantly agreed to help. Marley spent the night formulating a plan. They would need powerful flashlights, lots of lights to surround the area where they believed the laughing man would appear. And above all, someone brave enough to confront the creature. He couldn't help thinking that perhaps that person had to be him. Meanwhile, the lights in the village began to flicker again, and the children, including Marley's daughters, were becoming increasingly restless. Ava and Grace, who had so far remained aloof from the strangeness, began muttering things about a smiling figure in the shadows of the yard. Marley knew that time was running out. With the plan in hand and Sarah's revelations echoing in his mind, Marley realized that a confrontation with the smiler was inevitable. And when that confrontation came, he would be ready, or so he hoped. Night fell quickly over Glenwood Creek, bringing with it a thicker darkness than usual. The lights in the houses flickered more frequently, as if an invisible force was sucking the energy out of the village. Marley knew it was only a matter of time before the Grinch manifested again. Fear was spreading like a plague, and he could feel the tension on the faces of the neighbors and in the very eyes of his daughters, Ava and Grace. Marley and Paul had worked tirelessly to prepare the plan. They had gathered powerful flashlights and set up a kind of light barricade around Marley's house, which would be at the center of the operation. The plan was simple: use the light to attract and weaken the laughing man, while someone else would directly confront the creature in the shadows. Marley knew that he himself would have to be that person. Paul, although hesitant, agreed to help protect the children. He would take Ava, Grace, Lily, and the other children to a nearby house, away from the shadows that surrounded Marley's house. As long as the children were safe, Marley would put his plan into action. "Are you sure about this?" Paul asked for the 1,000th time, his voice filled with concern. "This might not work. What if he's stronger than we think?" Marley nodded, although doubt was present in her mind too. "We have no other choice. We can't keep running away from this nightmare. If we do nothing, it will take all our children, one by one." Paul looked at Marley's daughters, who were about to be taken to safety. Ava and Grace looked at their father with looks of fear and confusion. They didn't understand exactly what was happening, but they knew that something terrible was coming. Marley knelt down beside his daughters and hugged them tightly. "You'll be brave, okay?" he whispered. "I love you, and I'll do everything to keep you safe. I promise." Ava, the eldest, held back her tears and nodded, while Grace looked at him with big, frightened eyes, unable to speak. When Paul took the children away, Marley felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders increase. Now, he was alone. The lanterns were positioned around the house, spreading beams of light across the yard and windows. Marley knew that the creature preferred the dark, but the light could limit its movements, or at least weaken it enough for him to confront it. As the night deepened, Marley began to notice the absolute silence that enveloped the village. There were no sounds of wind, nor the usual noises of the night. It was as if the very atmosphere was waiting for the laughing man. The tension in the air was almost palpable. It was then that Marley heard it. First, a low, distant laugh, almost indistinguishable from the wind. He froze for a moment, trying to identify where it was coming from. The sound got louder, closer and closer, until he could hear it clearly. A childish giggle echoing in the shadows of the yard. Marley squeezed the flashlight in his hand, his heart beating hard in his chest. He knew that this was no ordinary child. This was the laughing man, playing with his mind, trying to instigate the fear that fed him. The light from the surrounding lanterns flickered for a brief second, and that's when he saw it. The figure in the shadows. At first it was just an indistinct outline, but soon Marley's eyes adjusted to what was in front of him. It was a tall, grotesque silhouette with a smile that was impossible to ignore, stretched in a distorted way from one ear to the other. It was the same smile as in the drawings of Emma, Lily, and the other children. The entity didn't move, it just watched, the smile unchanging on its face. "I know what you want," Marley said, her voice firm, despite her growing fear. "And I'm not going to let you take anyone else." The laughter stopped abruptly. The laughing man took a step forward, his shadowy forms swaying like smoke in the light of the lanterns. The smile, however, never disappeared. Marley felt his hands shaking, but he knew what he had to do. He remembered Sarah's words. To defeat the creature, he would have to face it, look at that smile and smile back, without fear. He swallowed dryly, feeling cold sweat trickle down the back of his neck. The entity approached slowly, the light from the lanterns seeming less effective as the dark being drew closer. Marley took a deep breath and, mustering all the courage she could, forced a smile onto her face. A smile that at first seemed false and forced, but which over time became more confident. "If that's what you want, then come and get me," Marley said through gritted teeth, keeping the smile. He looked straight into the creature's empty eyes, refusing to let fear take over. The laughing man stopped. For the first time since it had appeared, its expression changed. The grotesque smile faltered, as if something had disturbed its immutable nature. The light around Marley shone more brightly, and the entity began to retreat, the shadows fragmenting around it. Marley could feel that it was working. The creature was weakened. The smile he had forced was somehow breaking the laughing man's control, but he knew he couldn't falter. The entity was losing strength, but it was not yet destroyed. With one last guttural laugh, the laughing man disappeared into the shadows, dissolving completely. The silence that followed was deafening. Marley fell to his knees, panting, the smile still on his face. He didn't know if the laughing man had been defeated for good, but for now the children were safe. The real terror, however, was the uncertainty that the entity might return. And Marley knew that if it did, he would have to face it again, or find a way to destroy it forever. The calm that followed the disappearance of the laughing man seemed fragile, like a thin layer of ice on a deep lake. Marley had managed to drive the entity away, but in the back of his mind, he knew it was only temporary. The forced smile he had used to repel the creature had left a mark on him, something deeper than the relief he should have felt. In the days that followed, the village of Glenwood Creek seemed to return to normal. The children who had disappeared, like Emma and Tommy, still showed strange behavior, but the disappearances stopped. The lights stopped flickering at night, and the heavy silence that once dominated the village seemed to slowly dissipate. But Marley wasn't convinced. He knew that the laughing man hadn't disappeared completely. He was waiting. Then, in the early hours of a particularly silent night, Marley was woken by a familiar sound. Laughter. It wasn't a laugh of joy or jest, but the sinister laughter he was familiar with. He got up quickly and looked out of the window. The lights in the house were flashing again, and in the shadows in the distance he saw what he feared most, the silhouette of the laughing man, once again forming. The entity was back, and this time it seemed stronger, bolder. Marley realized that his previous attempt to confront it had temporarily weakened the creature, but it had returned, fueled by something he still didn't fully understand. Marley couldn't wait any longer. He knew that this time he had to finish the creature off once and for all. He grabbed his strongest flashlight, dressed quickly, and ran to Paul's house, where his daughters were. When he got there, he found Paul standing in the doorway looking worried. "Did you hear that?" Paul asked. "The laughter?" Marley nodded, the gravity of the situation clearly evident on his face. "He's back, Paul. This time I have to put a stop to it." Paul, although reluctant, knew there was no other option. The children of the village were at risk again, and this time there would be no second chance. Marley instructed Paul to keep the children away from the confrontation, ensuring that they remained surrounded by the light of the lanterns. With Ava, Grace, and the other children safe, Marley set off for the place where he knew he would have to face the Grinch, the old village park, a place the children used to frequent, now abandoned and overtaken by shadows. The park was immersed in darkness. The only light came from the stars and the flashlight that Marley held tightly. He knew he was heading straight for the laughing man's trap, but he had no choice. If he wanted to save his family and the other children, he had to confront the entity in the shadows one last time. As soon as he reached the center of the park, Marley saw the figure of the Grinch emerge from the darkness. It was taller and more menacing than before, with its grotesque smile even bigger and more distorted. The light from the lantern wavered for a moment, as if the presence of the creature was draining the energy around it. The grinner said nothing, but Marley could sense its intent. It wanted more than the children's fear. He wanted complete control. He wanted absolute terror. "Enough," Marley whispered to himself, determined not to let this happen. With the flashlight shining directly at the creature, Marley repeated what he knew was his only chance. He smiled. This time the smile wasn't forced. He was tired, exhausted by everything that had happened, but determined to win. His smile was not one of happiness, but of defiance. The entity seemed to hesitate. The smile on Laughing Man's face trembled slightly, as if the confidence he had previously exuded was beginning to break down. The torchlight was now burning brightly, and Marley took a step towards the creature. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," he said, his voice firm and controlled. "You will no longer control us." The Laughing Man retreated a little, but still seemed to struggle against the power of the light. Marley knew he needed something more. It was then that he remembered Sarah Whitley's words. The only way to defeat the creature would be to face it without fear, but there was also a missing piece. He would need to challenge the Laughing Man with the same strength that the entity used to control its victims. Marley then began to laugh. Not a forced or nervous laugh, but a strong, defiant laugh. A laugh that echoed through the park, mixed with the glow of the light that was now beginning to consume the surrounding shadows. The more he laughed, the more the creature receded, its grotesque smile slowly disappearing, until all that remained was a weak, wavering shadow. The torchlight shone brightly one last time, and with a distorted cry, the Laughing Man disappeared completely, dissipating into the darkness like a cloud of smoke. Marley stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily, still processing what had just happened. The park was silent again, but this time it was a peaceful silence. The shadows that had once been threatening now seemed normal, without the sinister presence of the entity. He had finally won. The laughing man had been defeated. When Marley returned home, the relief on Paul's and the children's faces was immediate. Ava and Grace ran to hug him, and he held them tight, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had finally fulfilled.